If you've ever watched a roller coaster video and wondered what on earth a 0G stall or an RMC hybrid is, then this is the video for you. From ride manufacturers to technical terms, let's break down all the coaster jargon so that you understand what the nerds are talking about. Right, let's start with the basics, the types of coaster, because not every ride is just a roller coaster. And yes, you'll finally be able to explain why Nemesis is not just that upside down thing. The first coaster we're going to cover is known as a floorless coaster, and I mean, it's named appropriately because the trains do not have a floor. Now, there's no examples of this one in the UK right now, but you can think of examples like Medusa or Kraken, and basically it is exactly what it says, right? The train itself, to save some weight, has no floor on it. It's just the chassis and the seats, and you'll see the floor disappear in the station before the ride leaves. And then the next type we've got is inverted coasters, which again, is a fairly self-explanatory name because this is the other way around to what a coaster would typically be. The track is on top, the coaster is underneath. So this would be something like Nemesis, Black Mamba, or Dragon's Challenge. And the next one we've got comes in a few flavors, and this is the boomerang coaster. Now, basically this is a single train, can only ever have a single train, because basically it will go along the track, get to the end, and then do the thing in reverse. So there are three versions of this. You have the family boomerang, which is typically made by Vekoma, and the example here in the UK would be something like the former Ben 10 or now Accelerator at Drayton Manor. There's no inversions on this, it is just a little family ride. You've then got the normal boomerang, which does have an inversion, and again, fairly standard layout. An example of this one would be Wipeout over at Pleasurewood Hills. And then you've got the giant boomerang, which is much more extreme, definitely has a number of inversions in it. Usually this one's a suspended coaster as well, but there's an example of this Stuntfall over at Park Warner in Madrid. Right, there are classifications for the heights of ride as well, and the first one I'm going to cover here is the hypercoaster, which is anything between 200 and 300 feet. Now, the first one of these was over in Cedar Point, Ohio, and it was Magnum XL200. Now, over here in the UK, we have the big one, which was actually a follow-up to Magnum, and if you've ridden both, you'll wonder why it came second, but that is anything between 200 and 300 feet. And then the next one we've got is the Giga coaster. Now, this is basically anything between 300 and 400 feet. Now, an example of this one out in the US is Pantherian, formerly known as Intimidator 305, and then also Red Force in Ferrari Land, which I believe is the tallest coaster in Europe. And then you got the Strata coaster, which is anything 400 foot and above. Well, I say that, there's potentially a new category coming shortly, but this is King Dakar that is no longer with us. That was the tallest coaster in the world. And then also Top Thrill Dragster, or Top Thrill 2 as it now is, in Cedar Point. And then the thing I was talking about, some of you might know there's a new coaster soon to open in the Middle East known as Falcon's Flight, and it will be the tallest, the fastest and the longest coaster in the world at over 600 feet, and this one is getting coined an Exa coaster. Again, back to the actual rides themselves though, the next term that you will hear probably quite a lot is a woody. And there's no surprises for this one, it is basically a coaster made of wood. So there's a number of examples here in the UK. You've got Wicker Man, you've got various at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, and then overseas you've got things like El Toro, etc. But yeah, if it is made purely from wood, it is a woody. Now, if it's a combination of wood and steel, then you'll hear it referred to as a hybrid coaster. And probably one of the most notable examples of this one is Iron Gwazi over at Busch Gardens, Tampa. And that is made by a manufacturer called RMC that we will cover later on, and they are notorious for taking old wooden coasters and then adding steel to them to make these hybrid coasters. Another example would be, and this might not occur to some people, but Gemini at Cedar Point, which is quite an old coaster because it was made in 1978, and it had wooden, or it has, should I say, a wooden structure, but it has tubular steel track. Right, the next one is notoriously uncommon. In fact, for some people this would be considered a swear word, and that is an SLC, which stands for Suspended Looping Coaster. And this is manufactured by another company we've not talked about yet called Vekoma. Now, the example you've got here in the UK, or the most notorious one, would be Infusion at Blackpool Pleasure Beach. Now, typically these all have the same layout, and they're known as headbangers. There are a couple of exceptions. So also in the UK at Flamingo Land we have Kamali, which is still an SLC, but it is a different layout known as their Shenlin layout, and there are a couple of custom examples. Internationally, there are plenty of these. Some are okay. In fact, one of them really good at Morris Pier in America, known as the Great Nor'easter, is actually really, really smooth. And then there are some other examples that are just not smooth. So yeah, if you hear people talking about SLC, run. Right, the last coaster type we're going to talk about is a wing coaster, and it's fairly unimaginatively named because, well, the kind of train hangs off the track like a set of wings. So obviously you've got a normal coaster where you have the track and the train on top. You have the inverted coaster where the track is above and the coaster is underneath, and in this case the track sits with the train hanging over both sides of it. So examples here in the UK, you have Mandrill Mayhem at Chessington, and you have Swarm at Thorpe Park. Internationally there are various examples of this. One of the newest one is Rapterra in King's Dominion. Right, so getting away from the coasters for a little minute, the next thing you'll hear many people talking about are flat rides. You might think, what's a flat ride? It's not flat in terms of its shape. It is basically just any ride that is stationary and not a coaster. So for example, if you had dodgems, or if you had waltzers, or if you had a giant swing, or a gyro swing, or a carousel, or any of these attractions, or shot towers, these are all known as flat rides. And then the other type that you will get are dark rides. Now, as the name probably suggests, these are typically indoor attractions, and they don't have to be that dark. Some of them are. So if you had a ghost train, for example, that is technically a dark ride, and those probably have very little lighting intentionally to give that kind of scare factor. But even if you have something that is a little bit more bright on the inside, something like Alice in Wonderland in Blackpool Pleasure Beach, certainly not dark because it is very well illuminated and very ultraviolet, but it is still classed as a dark ride. Okay, now that we've gone through the breeds of coaster, let's talk about what they actually do. The twists, the rolls and the stalls that make people go nope before they've even got in the queue. The first one that you are going to hear is a barrel roll, sometimes known as a heartline roll. And this is basically a form inversion where you're going forward and you are rotating. And the reason it gets the name heartline roll is because in effect the center of rotation is your heart. So it sits here and you go around, and that is how you do your inversion. There is another one known as an inline twist, where the track is the center of rotation, so you basically go around the track. But basically, they are both different types of inversion. Right, the next one we've got is a cobra roll, which gets its name because there's a loose connection in shape to a cobra's head. But this is one of the ones from that Vekoma boomerang that I was talking about earlier, because basically you kind of go up through, it looks like you're going to start doing a loop, and then when you get part of the way through, you then kind of twist and go sideways, and then you go into the other half of another symmetrical loop and come back out the other side. So you should do an inversion through a cobra roll. Right, the next one we've got is a fairly obvious one, and it is known as a helix. And it is basically what it says. It is a spiral piece of track. And if you've ever seen Theme Park Worldwide, when he does his videos, he is well known for chanting helix, 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 as he goes around them. Right, so a version on that barrel roll that we were talking about earlier is known as a JoJo roll. And the subtle difference here is that it's when you exit the station and it's taken very slowly before you get to a lift hill or launch mechanism of some description. So two examples I can think of, one is the Ride to Happiness at Plopsaland, Japan, and the other one is Hydra at Dorney Park. Another one that you will hear people talking about is a top hat. Now this is basically just a hill that you crest and come back down, but it's quite a sort of pointed hill, if you will. And so an example of that might be something like the start off icon at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, that goes straight into a top hat. If you look at some of the kind of launch coasters like Top Thrill 2 or Red Force, or even Stealth here in the UK, they are also top hats. Right, there's a couple of elements that give the rider the feeling that they are weightless. And one of them is known as a 0G roll. Now it's similar to the barrel roll in terms of the style of inversion, but it is typically at the top of an airtime hill, and yeah, you will basically feel like you're coming out of your seat and therefore you're weightless as you go through this element. Now the other one you'll get is a 0G stall, which the difference here is that when you go upside down, you're held upside down for a period before flipping back round to the right way around. And you'll see examples of this on things like Zadra, Gotham City Escape, and various other attractions around the world. Right, you've seen the rides and the elements. Let's talk through some of the weird terms that coaster nerds use. Think of this a bit like Duolingo for theme parks, except without the owl. Right, one I've said many times in videos, and I always get people asking what it is ERT. ERT stands for Exclusive Ride Time. Now typically this means that that ride is closed to the public and only a select group who have paid for access to it will be allowed to use this ride. It often happens before the park opens or sometimes after the park has closed. There may be exceptions where it's during normal operating hours, but it is basically like a private event for one or more coasters, and it usually costs a decent chunk of change. Another thing you'll hear a lot of us talking about is airtime, and that is basically where you are not in your seat. The more times that you are kind of lifted off of your seat, or the train goes down and you stay put, or you get kicked out of it, there's various types of, there's ejector, there's floater, etc. But basically, if you are off that seat, it is known as airtime. Another common one you'll hear is cred or credit. Basically, a number of enthusiasts, myself included, count how many roller coasters we have been on around the world. And there are various tools to do this. The one I use is Coaster Count. It has both a website and an app. But basically, any coaster is counted as a cred. Another term you will hear is IP. Now, that's different from the computer term IP. In this case, it means intellectual property. And that is where a park will have licensed a particular brand for one of its attractions. So things like in Portaventura, they have an Uncharted ride. So that is licensing in the game. You'll see in Chessington, they've got Jumanji stuff, etc. This is known as an IP. Right, another acronym that you will hear is SBNO, which means standing but not operating. And that is, as the name suggests, for any attraction that has not been demolished but is also not open to the public. Now, I don't just mean it is closed for the day. I mean something that has closed for a sustained period of time. Probably never going to open again. But yeah, SBNO, standing but not operating. Now, a safety mechanism on all attractions is known as an e-stop, and it is an emergency stop. So something has happened, the sensors are not happy, they think something is not where it should be, or they can't get a measurement from one of the sensors, the ride will e-stop. Now, the operators can e-stop as well if they see something and they need to shut the ride down. Basically, it cuts all power and you need to evacuate from that ride. A little one you might hear is GP, it just means general public. So you'll see quite a few of us content creators putting up POVs. Just means point of view. If you've ever heard the term valid, oh it's valid, the train valid, etc. All it means is that the train has come to a stop at one of the lowest points in the track, and basically it has not completed the circuit. So obviously no park wants that, because to recover a valid train typically requires closing the ride, closing the park, getting a crane in, you know, either lifting that train back up again to a highest point and letting it complete the track, or dismantling it. Hyperia here in the UK valid a few times and they had to close the ride for several days, get a crane in, dismantle the ride, take it back to the workshop, put it all back together again. Now sometimes some rides have a mechanism to get that train going again, but we'll cover that one later on. You'll often hear theme park nerds talking about different forces that you feel on a ride. And one of them is lateral forces. Now that just basically means you're getting pushed to the side. So some of these attractions, they just take the corners at some force and you get pinned to the inside or the outside of the train, and that is basically lateral forces. You then also get negative Gs. Now negative Gs is where you feel lighter than you typically are. So that is where like you feel like you're lifting up and the train is going away from you and you feel light. Positive Gs is the exact opposite. Typically when you're going into some of the elements, you get pushed right into that seat and you feel quite heavy and forceful. That is positive Gs. Right, we are about halfway through your lesson, and I hope you're taking notes because there is an exam at the end. Only joking, but you can grade me. Give me a thumbs up if you're enjoying this, or thumbs down if you're not. Right, so who actually builds these things? Let's talk about the companies behind the madness and which ones are responsible for making you scream, never again! One of the manufacturers who is at the top of their game right now is Intamin. Now they mainly do coasters, but they do also do some of those flat rides that we were talking about. Attractions that you would know them for, well, they made Velocicoaster, and I'm sure everybody watching this video has heard of that ride. Here in the UK, something like Stealth. The next manufacturer seems to be having a little bit of a rough patch right now. Now, these guys were known as one of the elite coaster manufacturers in the sort of 80s, 90s and 2000s, and that is B&M, which stands for Bollard and Mabillard. Now these guys have made coasters all over the world that you will recognise. Here in the UK, they're responsible for Nemesis. Internationally, they are responsible for things like SheiKra, so any of the dive coasters that you see, that was B&M. A German manufacturer that you will probably know some of the rides for is Mack Rides. Now they also own a theme park themselves. Out in Germany, they own Europa Park. In terms of the actual rides themselves, again, here in the UK, you've got things like Icon and Hyperia, and over in America, they have just launched Stardust Racers at Epic Universe. This next manufacturer seems to have done the exact opposite of what I just said B&M did. And that is that notoriously they were not the best rides. Not in terms of safety, just in terms of comfort. And yet now, their modern rides are amongst the smoothest out there. And that is Vekoma. Now, going back to that swear word I mentioned earlier, the SLC, these guys built that. The Boomerang, these guys built that as well. But now they are starting to do these ridiculously smooth rides. So in America, I recently went on Flash Vertical Velocity at Six Flags Great Adventure. Beautiful ride, super, super smooth. The new tilt coasters that we're starting to see pop up. An example, Siren's Curse at Cedar Point. Again, that was Vekoma. So they are currently in a really, really good spot. There's a manufacturer that we don't have here in the UK. And there are some that think that is to do with safety regulations and the trains don't meet our regulations. I do not know. But if you've ever heard of RMC, and people saying, oh, we want an RMC in the UK, well, it stands for Rocky Mountain Construction. And they make various rides like Iron Gwazi that you've probably heard of. Untamed in Europe, that is also one of theirs. Right, there's a few manufacturers that no longer operate, but you will still hear people talking about their rides because they had quite a lasting impression. One of those is Aerodynamics. Now, they were the ones that were responsible for the hypercoasters in the early days, so Magnum XL 200, the big one, etc. In fact, again, at Blackpool, a number of the attractions are by Aerodynamics. You have the big one, you have Revolution, you have Steeplechase, and I think some of the dark rides as well are Aerodynamics. Oh, and the Log Flume used to be. The next one that no longer is with us is Schwarzkopf. Now, this was named after Anton Schwarzkopf, and they ceased to operate in 1995. Some of the attractions that they manufactured, so one of the ones that's still going to this day in Hershey Park is Super Duper Looper. One that was recently removed from Busch Gardens was Scorpion, and then here in the UK we have Cannonball Express. Now, when it comes to wooden coasters, there are a couple of different manufacturers. And interestingly, you'll often find that the ride manufacturer and the train manufacturer are not the same. So you will hear, oh, they've put these type of trains on this ride, not necessarily made by the same company. One of the wooden coaster manufacturers is Custom Coasters International. Now, they went bankrupt in 2002, and some of the attractions that they were responsible for, Stampeda over at Portaventura, which I'm not a massive fan of, but again, my problem with it is the trains. And then the Great White at Morris Pier, which I was unfortunately not able to get on because they were changing the trains and it wasn't operating. Right, another manufacturer that is similar sounding, so instead of CCI, it is GCI, and that is Great Coasters International. Now, they have various wooden coasters, but one example here in the UK would be Wickerman, and internationally at Europa Park would be Wodan. The last wooden manufacturer I'm going to mention is the Gravity Group. Now, these guys have made a number of coasters internationally. One of the ones that I particularly enjoyed over in Emerald Park was the Coo Cullen. One that I didn't enjoy, on the other hand, was in Florida at a fun spot known as Mindblower. The next manufacturer is one that I'm not a huge fan of typically. There are some exceptions to the rule, and that is Gerstlauer. Now, these guys make various attractions around the world, most notably the Smiler here in the UK, which still holds the record for the most inversions anywhere in the world. Personally not a fan of the trains, don't find them the most comfortable. You will often find they use the sort of vertical lift hill element. So saw the ride at Thorpe Park, that is also one of theirs. But there are some exceptions that I do find comfortable. So Anubis over at Plopsaland Japan, that's one of theirs. This next one is a manufacturer responsible for a ride that has just closed at the time of filming. Now, the ride manufacturer is Maurer Rides, and more often than not you will see these guys responsible for spinning coasters. So you've got Dragon's Fury at Chessington, you've got Spinball at Alton Towers, you've got Winge's Fear and Force at Phantasialand, etc. But they also had this ride type known as the Maurer X-Car, and there used to be one in Drayton Manor, but most notably there was one out at Universal known as Rip Ride Rocket. I wasn't a huge fan, those trains were not comfortable, and it also had that vertical lift hill. But yeah, the ride closed yesterday at the time of filming, so I can't get on that anymore. Right, the next manufacturer is S&S. Now, these guys do some coasters, but they also do flat rides. Now, if you've been on a shot tower, so something like Launchpad at Blackpool Pleasure Beach or Cliffhanger at Flamingoland, those are S&S towers, right? And they tend to come in a shot or drop combination. Sometimes they shoot you up, sometimes they drop you from the top, sometimes they do both. But they also do some coasters, the 4D coasters, and that is kind of like spinning coasters around the track. So the Joker at Six Flags Great Adventure, that is one of theirs. And then there's some quirky little rides. Now, they made this one called Sky Swat, I think it was called. You'll know it as the Slammer from Thorpe Park. Now finally removed, it's been SBNO for the last 10 years, but that was made by S&S. The next manufacturer, I mean, it's a bit like Vekoma, right? Where I said that they used to make horrific coasters and they are now making stellar coasters. I don't know if it's quite that extreme with this next lot, but Zamperla, they're usually smaller family attractions. But they are also known for some of the most uncomfortable rides. There's a ride known as Valari, and it is an attempt at a flying coaster, and if you're in the UK, you'll know it as Hero at Flamingoland, and it is not very comfortable. On the flip side though, these guys were responsible for converting Top Thrill Dragster into Top Thrill 2. And at the time of recording, that is my #1 coaster because it is absolutely fabulous. There's another manufacturer that for some reason isn't in the UK and I'm not quite sure why. And that is Premier Rides. Now, initially I thought this was also a manufacturer that I'm not a huge fan of because they have rides like Tigris, which is their kind of Skyrocket 2, and it's got these weird comfort collar things, and it's just a strange ride. But then I also realised that they are responsible for Revenge of the Mummy at Universal, and I love that ride. So again, some of these manufacturers have real hits and misses. Right, it's time for the advanced class, the parts of the coaster that you've probably seen many times and not known what they are. And if you're still watching at this point, congratulations, you're one of us. Right, so nowadays you're starting to see coasters propelled by magnets, right? Historically it was lift hills, which you still get, or hydraulic launches. Well, more and more they're starting to use magnetic propulsion because there's no moving parts, it is a lot easier to maintain. There are two versions of this. One is known as LSM, which is linear synchronous motor, and one is known as LIM, linear induction motor. The main difference is that with an LSM, there are permanent magnets on the train and there are electromagnets on the track. Whereas with the LIM, there are magnets on the track and there is a conductive plate on the train. Right, if you've ever heard anyone talking about an OTSR, it just means over-the-shoulder restraints. Now, you might have heard the term air gates before, and you'll definitely have experienced air gates, but you might have not known that's what they are referred to. It's basically on a number of attractions where there are physical gates that open just before the ride starts to let you get on that train, and then they close. Now, you'll often hear members of staff saying stay off the air gates. In fact, Ryan the ride mechanic is notorious for it, it's one of his slogans. There's a reason for that. There are sensors on the gates to make sure that, you know, it is blocked and people cannot get to the train. If you lean on or swing on those gates and you trigger a sensor, it can shut the entire ride down. So yeah, as Ryan says, stay off the air gates. Right, you've probably heard people talking about blocks or block sections. Basically, it is where the roller coaster is chunked up into little sections, and each section can have no more than one train occupying it at any given time. Usually, the rule is that there can be one less train than the number of sections on the track. Sometimes you don't get that far, but if you've got a ride that has 4 sections, 4 block sections, you could more often than not have 3 trains on it. Sometimes you'll only get 2. Effectively, this is just where the computer is monitoring all the trains, and as soon as it sees that one has left a block, it then can allow another train into that section. There can never be 2 trains in the same block. Right, connected to that, you will hear people talking about a mid-course brake run. And despite the name, it doesn't have to be halfway through the course, it can be a little bit further. And effectively, this is just a place that the ride can come to a complete stop, and it's usually on elevated or got a slight kind of incline on it, so that obviously when they let go of the brakes, it can then finish the rest of the course. Classic example would be the big one. There's definitely a mid-course brake run. I've climbed up it, there's a lot of steps. Right, on modern coasters, there are 3 sets of wheels. You have your running wheels, which are basically the ones that go along the track. You have your side friction wheels. These are the ones that keep you on the track so that when it gets to a corner, the train goes round. And then you have upstop wheels, which is so that when there is kind of like the top of a hill, the train doesn't leave the track. And basically between all 3 of these wheels, you're clamped onto that track, you ain't going anywhere. A term that frustrates a lot of enthusiasts is a trim brake. Now, you can probably guess from the name, but it's designed to slow you down a little bit. It's not going to bring you to a complete halt. It doesn't have that ability to do so, but it will reduce your speed. Now, in some cases, these are dynamic. If the ride detects that the train is going too fast, it will just put a little trim on there to slow you down. In some cases, it is just permanently active. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. Sometimes it is simply because of the forces. An example recently was Stardust Racers at Epic Universe, and a trim brake was added quite late on in the development, And it was because of the regulations in the area that stated that humans are not allowed to hit a certain number of Gs. And this very, very slightly went over it, like so little that you wouldn't have felt it, but it was enough to not get the ride signed off, and they just had to put this teeny tiny trim on to just slow it ever so slightly. And sometimes it is more kind of extreme because you're maybe going way too fast and they need to kind of calm you down a little bit. But yeah, you'll often find trim brakes where you really don't want them. Right, another term that you will have heard, no doubt, is the transfer track. And as the name suggests, this is the way to transfer the train onto and off of that track, especially if it is a multi-train ride. Obviously, they need a way throughout the day to add or remove those coasters. There's a number of different mechanisms for this one. It's usually a switch track, for example, where you'll see a piece of track with two different directions and it literally slides across to connect. So either you're going this way or it slides and then you're going this way, one into the warehouse, one into the ride itself. In some cases, it is a couple of parallel tracks that slide across, train goes on the track, slides back across. And then there's a rather unique example of one in the big one at Blackpool Pleasure Beach, where the whole track lifts up. There's actually multiple tiers. You've got the running track, you've got the engineering track, and then you've got the pit. So they can have 3 trains, not all on there at once, they can only have 2 on the lift at any given time, but basically it lifts up. But yeah, that is a transfer track. Believe it or not, when I was looking at terminologies on, I think it was coasterforce.com, they explained a seatbelt. I'm kind of hoping I don't need to tell you what a seatbelt is, but you get them on roller coasters. Right, there you go. That is a lot of information. Hopefully the next time you hear one of us on YouTube or one of your friends in a park throw out some terminology, you'll know what they're talking about. If there's anything that you've heard that I haven't covered in this video, chuck it in the comments down below and I will try and get back to you as soon as I possibly can. As always, I've been Chris, you've been watching Coaster Dad, and I shall see you in the next one. Adios!